Well, Nancy, I want to join my colleagues in paying tribute to you and your colleagues for what you have done at the Center for Global Development. I'm not surprised because, as you said, I know you very well. And why are you laughing? She was my classmate. That's her story, okay? And my story. So I know how good she is. And thank you for inviting me. I would like to introduce the topic by saying that as early as 1990, early 1990s, even before the so-called, as Joe Stiglitz called it, the roaring 90s, well before it was evident what has happened already in the 21st century, there were people that were pointing out in a very sharp way that this contemporary globalization or increasing interdependence would pose unprecedented challenges of international coordination and cooperation. There are many examples, but in particular, I remember a report that was produced under the leadership of Willy Brandt, and although he died before the report was published, it was published in 94 or 95. It was called Our Global Neighborhood. And it is striking to read it again and to recognize how current the diagnosis and the prescriptions about what had to be done to start confronting these new challenges of interdependence look today. In fact, what they did is to propose, among other things, that something that looks very much like the G20 should be created. They call it something like an Economic Security Council.
Which is also...
Right. And, and that perhaps is a good news, recognizing the vision and the intellect of those people. But the bad news is that that was almost 20 years ago. But there are other bad news, which I think are very bad. And that despite the recognition that we needed to move or we needed to shift gears in terms of international coordination, very little has happened ever since. There has been a lot of rhetoric, a lot of initiatives, but I would say that the balance in terms of concrete achievements is really discouraging. And I would say at this point it's not only discouraging, but it is frightening. When one makes an inventory of things like the Millennium Development Goals, when one thinks about Kofi Annan's initiative to reform the United Nations, culminating with the failure of the World Summit in 2005, when one thinks, of course, about what has happened with the compliance of the Kyoto Agreement and the design of the post-Kyoto regime, when one thinks about the launching of the Doha round and the failure to conclude successfully the Doha round, and perhaps even more worrisome, when one thinks about the launching, the formation of the G20, and one goes through the list of commitments that were made by the G20 between the Washington meeting in the fall of 2008 and the Pittsburgh meeting in the fall of 2009, and we look what has happened today, I am afraid that we must be very worried, because the degree of success is very small, and I would say in crucial issues is probably nil. And that is a terrible news, because if it was justified 20 years ago to think about the need to have new instruments of international coordination, then it is even more justified and urgent to do it today. Because not only we have these complexities derived from this more intense and extensive interdependence, but we are going through an unprecedented process of rebalancing in the global economy and the global geopolitics. And I am afraid that this rebalancing, as well as addressing what you call, the provision of global public goods or the prevention of global public bads, truly require a degree, certainly of understanding, but an incredible degree of cooperation, of sharing sovereignty, of mitigating free-riding problems, in general addressing the problems that are usually encountered to provide those global public goods. And I think the G20, which of course is an excellent idea, is at the same time the litmus test of whether the international community or international leaders can really be up to the challenge. And at least in my modest view, the results delivered until today are very bad. Kemal says, well, at least the G20 has not supplanted the IMF. Well, I don't think that's enough. If they really meant what they said about the framework for a strong, sustained, and balanced growth, then they should have empowered the IMF to carry out a more effective surveillance, I would say, authority. And in fact, what they did was to undermine the IMF, because they said, we'll do it, and you are just the secretariat. And in fact, in the very same Pittsburgh Declaration, they put the IMF at the same rank as other multilateral institutions. And if you go how the process has evolved from Pittsburgh to the last time that the ministers met, at the time in April, I think it's a disaster. It's a joke. It's not a serious exercise. And I don't know whether we will have to wait for another major crisis before our leaders, go back to the premises that put them together in November of 2008 and decide or recognize at last that this cannot be business as usual.
Thank you, Ernesto.